At my son's engagement party, I handed him an envelope with a card I'd made myself, the kind with pressed flowers from my garden, the kind I'd been making since he was small. His fiancée took one look at it, passed it to him without opening it, and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Is that a savings bond?" Oh, sweetheart, how quaint. Everyone laughed. My son looked at his shoes, and I stood there in my good blouse from the bay, the one I'd ironed twice that morning, holding a glass of sparkling water I'd stopped tasting. I didn't cry. I smiled, set down my glass, and drove home in the dark. The next morning, I called my accountant. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I'm 63 years old, I've been a widow for 11 years, and for the past 32 of those years, I have been doing something nobody in that party room knew about. Not my son, not his fiancée, not her parents, who spent most of that evening telling me about their condo in Scottsdale. The card they'd laughed at had contained a check for $20,000. My son never opened it. I found it in my coat pocket when I got home. He'd handed it back without noticing. I drove to the party in a 12-year-old Civic. I live in a 2-bedroom house in Waterloo, Ontario, the same house I've lived in since 1991. My neighbor thinks I work part-time at a garden center, which is technically true. I volunteer there on Thursdays because I like the smell of soil in the morning. What my neighbor doesn't know, what almost no one knows, is that I own the building the garden center operates out of. I own 11 other commercial properties across Waterloo region. I own a 48-unit residential complex in Guelph, and I hold an investment portfolio that, as of last quarter, sits just north of $4 million. I started with one duplex in 1992. My husband and I bought it with money we'd saved from his electrician's wage and mine from the school board, where I worked as an educational assistant. $47,000 for a duplex on a dead-end street. Everyone said it was a bad idea. The furnace was 30 years old. The basement smelled like old carpet, and the neighborhood had a reputation. We fixed it ourselves on weekends. I learned to patch drywall from a library book. We rented both units to young families and used the income to save for the next one. When my husband died in 2013, I kept going, quietly, the way I'd always done things. I never told my son because I wanted him to learn what I had learned. That value doesn't come from what you're handed. That work is not something to be ashamed of. I wanted him to build something with his own hands, and I thought that if he knew about the money, he wouldn't bother. I was wrong about a lot of things when it came to my son. His fiancée, I'll call her what she was because this story requires honesty, had been chipping away at him for 2 years before that engagement party. Not dramatically, quietly, the way water changes stone. She came from a family with a Rosedale address and opinions about everything. She called my cooking home style, which she meant as a compliment but didn't land as one. She once referred to my late husband's trade as hands-on work, with a small pause before hands-on that told me everything I needed to know. My son had started doing it too. The pause. The small deflection when someone asked what his mother did for work. "She's retired," he'd say, though I'd never once called myself that. After the engagement party, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. The check was still in my hand. $20,000 in my own handwriting, returned without being opened. Before we go any further, have you ever given someone something that took years to save and watched them treat it like it was nothing? Drop a comment. I read every one. And if stories like this are what you come here for, subscribe. You're going to want to hear how this ends. The morning after the party, I called my accountant, a woman named Frances, who has handled my affairs for 19 years and who has the particular talent of never sounding surprised. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you want to restructure anything?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, "but I want to understand where everything stands." She sent me a summary by end of day. Properties, portfolio, a small business holding company I'd set up in 2008. The total figure was one I knew, but seeing it laid out in black and white made it feel different, real, in a new way. Like looking at something you built over decades and finally being able to see the whole shape of it. I made myself a cup of tea and thought about my son, about the boy who used to bring me dandelions from the backyard because he thought they were beautiful, about the man who'd watched his fiancée hand back my card and said nothing. People change. I knew that, but I also knew that sometimes people don't change. They just become more clearly who they were already becoming. I needed to know which one I was looking at. I called my son the next day. He didn't bring up the party. Neither did I. We talked about the wedding venue they'd chosen, a restored heritage property in Elora, the kind of place with exposed stone walls and a sommelier on staff. I asked how much it cost. He told me, casually, like the number was ordinary, $38,000 for the venue alone before catering. We're managing, he said. I asked if they needed anything. He said no. I said good and told him I loved him. After I hung up, I sat very still. I knew my son's salary. He'd mentioned it when he got his last raise, $64,000 a year, which is decent, honest money. His fiancée worked in marketing at a tech firm downtown. I didn't know her salary, but I knew their apartment. I'd helped him move in. The rent was not $64,000 a year money. I called Frances again. I need the name of someone, I said. Someone discreet, someone who can find out if there are financial problems I should know about. She gave me a name. A man who'd done work for two of her other clients, retired from financial crimes investigation with the RCMP. Thorough, she said. Professional. His name was Gordon Ash. We met at a Tim Hortons on King Street, which felt very Canadian and somehow appropriate. He was in his late 60s, a big, quiet man who ordered a large double-double and pulled a notebook from his jacket pocket like he was settling in for a long conversation. He asked me what I was worried about. I told him I wasn't sure. I told him about the engagement party, about the venue cost, about the things I'd noticed over 2 years that I hadn't let myself add up until now. Leave it with me, he said. 2 weeks. The 2 weeks were strange. I kept to my routines. Thursday at the garden center, Tuesday grocery run to the St. Jacobs Market, Wednesday morning walk along the trail by my house. I didn't call my son. He didn't call me. The silence between us had a texture I recognized, the texture of a conversation we were both pretending wasn't necessary. Gordon called on a Thursday afternoon. Could I meet him the next day? We went back to the same Tim Hortons. He ordered the same coffee. He put a folder on the table between us and let me look. My son's fiancée had a line of credit she was carrying at near maximum. She had credit card debt spread across 3 cards, which Gordon had traced through what he could access legally. Public records, some court filings, a bankruptcy notice from 4 years ago that had been discharged but left a trail. She had declared personal bankruptcy at 26. Her family's Rosedale address was a rental. The condo in Scottsdale belonged to her aunt. I looked at the folder for a long time. My son, I said, does he know? Hard to say what he knows, Gordon said, but his accounts are clean. No debt beyond his car. He's been making large deposits to a joint account in the last 8 months. He paused. About $900 a month? I did the math quietly. My son, on his salary, was covering most of their life, and she was spending. I sat back and looked at the window. Outside, a woman was loading groceries into a minivan, a toddler on her hip. Ordinary Thursday afternoon in Waterloo. What do I do with this? I asked, though I already knew. Gordon looked at me steadily. That depends on what you want to happen. I thought about my son at the engagement party, looking at his shoes while the room laughed at my card. I thought about him making $900 deposits every month while they booked a $38,000 venue. I thought about the bankruptcy notice filed 4 years ago and never mentioned. I need to think, I said. I paid for the coffees and drove home. I spent 3 evenings at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, the old-fashioned way. Not to make a plan, to understand what I actually wanted. Because revenge is easy to mistake for justice, and I was determined not to make that mistake. What I wanted was simple. I wanted my son to see clearly, not to hurt his fiancée, not to destroy anything, but to make sure he was walking into this marriage with his eyes open. If he knew and chose her anyway, that was his right. But he needed to know. The problem was that I'd tried to tell him things before, about her spending, about small things I'd noticed. He'd shut it down every time. "You just don't know her the way I do, Mum." And maybe that was true, but the folder on the Tim Hortons table suggested otherwise. I thought about calling him directly, laying out what Gordon had found. I played the conversation in my head. He'd defend her. He'd say I was interfering. He'd say I'd hired someone to dig up dirt on the woman he loved because I couldn't accept that he'd grown up and made his own choices. He might not be wrong, so I waited. I chose patience, which is the hardest choice and the most useful one. And then, 9 days later, something happened that made patience unnecessary. My son called me on a Tuesday morning. He didn't say hello the way he usually did. His voice had a tone I recognized from when he was 15, the tone of someone who has done something they can't undo and is trying to figure out how to start. "Mom," he said, "I need to ask you something." He asked if I would be willing to help them with the wedding costs. "Not all of it," he said quickly. "Just some." They were finding it tighter than expected. The venue deposit was due and some other things had come up. I asked him to come over. He arrived that evening alone. His fiancée was at a work event, he said. He sat at my kitchen table in the same chair he'd sat in since he was 7 years old, and I made tea, and neither of us said anything for a minute. Then I put the folder on the table. He looked at it, looked at me. "Where did you get this?" he said. Not a question. He already knew I'd found something. "From someone who knows how to find things," I said. "Gordon Ash, former RCMP, Francis recommended him. You hired someone to investigate my fiancé. I hired someone to understand what my son had gotten into." He opened the folder. I watched his face while he read. He read slowly, the way he'd always read, going back to check things. The credit cards, the joint account withdrawals, the bankruptcy notice. He got to the bankruptcy notice and stopped. He sat there for a long time with his hands flat on the table. "She told me she had some debt from her early 20s, he said finally. "She said she'd sort it out." "She did sort it out," I said. "She filed for bankruptcy." "That is one way to sort it out." He looked up at me. "Did you know about this before the party?" "No. I hired Gordon after the party. Because of the card." His voice was quiet. "Because of the card," I said. "And because you looked at your shoes while a room full of people laughed at something that took me 30 years to save." The silence stretched between us. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, it was starting to rain the way it does in Waterloo in April, thin and persistent. "What's in the joint account?" I asked. He told me. He'd been putting money in every month to cover the shortfall because she was between good months, which was a phrase she'd used so many times he'd stopped noticing it. He'd drained most of his TFSA. He hadn't told me because he didn't want me to worry. "How much?" I said. He told me. I put both hands around my tea mug. $31,000 in 8 months. "She doesn't know I know," he said. "She thinks the joint account is just for shared expenses." I looked at my son, my careful, decent, hardworking son, and I thought about all the things I should have said 2 years ago and didn't. About the ways I'd softened my concerns because I didn't want him to feel like I was criticizing his choices. About the $20,000 check he'd handed back without opening. "You need to have a conversation with her," I said. "Not me. You." He nodded slowly. "But first," I said, "there's something I need to tell you." I got up, went to the study, and came back with my own folder, the one Francis had put together. The properties, the portfolio, the company. I put it on the table next to Gordon's folder. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked up at me. "Mom," he said, "what is this?" "It's what I've been doing since 1992, I said. "While I drove the Civic and kept the house and made cards with pressed flowers." He picked up the first page, put it down, picked it up again. "The check," he said quietly. "In the card, $20,000. He closed his eyes. I let him sit with it. "I've learned over 63 years that some things need room to land before you can talk about them." He needed a few minutes to understand that the woman who'd been laughed at in her babe blouse had been quietly building something his fiancé's family couldn't afford to buy. When he opened his eyes, they were wet. "I'm sorry," he said, "about the party." About I should have said something. You should have, I said, but that's not what this is about. He looked at the folder again. 48 units in Guelph since 2009. And he looked at the commercial properties. Is this the building on Herb Street? And 3 others on Weber? He let out a long breath. Not a laugh. Something between disbelief and relief, like a man who's been holding something heavy and has just realized he can put it down. She said you were a sweet woman, he told me. She said it in a tone that meant, I know what it meant, I said. He was quiet again. Then, what do I do? I wrapped both hands around my mug. You talk to her. You tell her you know about the bankruptcy. You ask her to be honest with you about the debt. And then you listen very carefully to how she answers. Not what she says, but how she answers. And if then you make a decision, but you make it with clear eyes. I looked at him steadily. You are your father's son. You work hard, you're honest, and you have good judgment when you use it. Use it. He stayed for another hour. We talked about his father, which we hadn't done in a while. We talked about the duplex on the dead-end street, which he barely remembered. I told him about the furnace, about the library book on drywall, about the first time a tenant called me at midnight because of a leak, and I drove over in my housecoat and fixed it myself because I couldn't afford a plumber. He laughed, which was the first time I'd heard him laugh in a while. When he left, he hugged me at the door. A long one, the kind he used to give me when he was small. I stood on the porch in the April rain and watched his car pull away. Before we continue, I know some of you are wondering whether this is a revenge story or something else. I've been asking myself the same thing. Drop revenge or something else in the comments. I'll be reading. He had the conversation with his fiancée 4 days later. She cried. She told him the bankruptcy had been a mistake she'd made when she was young, that she'd been embarrassed and didn't know how to bring it up, that she'd meant to tell him. She said the debt on the credit cards was temporary. She said a lot of things. Then she asked if I had told him. When he said he'd found out on his own, she went very quiet. She called me the following morning. I let it ring. She left a voicemail that I listened to once, standing in my kitchen in the early light. Her voice was controlled, careful. She said she understood I had concerns, that she respected I was protective of my son, that she hoped we could have a conversation as adults. I didn't call back. 3 days after that, my son called me. We've decided to postpone the wedding, he said. I didn't say anything. Not cancel, postpone. She needs some time to get the financial situation sorted out. A proper plan, a real one. He paused. She didn't know about the folder you put together. I didn't tell her you hired someone, but she knows I know. And he stopped. Started again. She's upset. Started again. She's upset. But she's also relieved, I think. Like she'd been carrying it and now she doesn't have to pretend anymore. I thought about that. About the weight of pretending. I understood it better than most. How are you? I asked. Tired, he said. But okay. Clearer than I've been in a while. I asked if he needed anything. He said not right now. Then, quietly, Mum, the properties. I had no idea. I know. Why didn't you ever? Because I wanted you to be the man you are, I said. Not someone who took it for granted. He was quiet for a moment. Can I come on Thursday? To the garden center? I used to like it there when I was little. Thursday I'm there from 8, I said. Bring coffee. He came. He's been coming most Thursdays since. He doesn't say much, just works beside me, moving flats of seedlings or turning compost, the way he used to dig in the yard when he was 7. We talk sometimes. About his father. About money. Carefully. About what he wants to build. He and his fiancée are still together. They're in counseling, which I think is the right thing. She's working with a financial advisor and has put herself on a debt repayment plan. My son told me this with something in his voice that I can only describe as careful hope, the kind you hold loosely because you know it can break. I don't know how it ends. I don't know if they'll marry or part, if she'll become someone he can trust, or if the gap between who she presented herself to be and who she actually is will prove too wide to cross. That's not mine to know. What I know is this. My son drove out to the Guelph property with me last month. We walked the grounds of the complex on a gray November morning, and I showed him how the books worked, how I'd structured the ownership, what I'd learned about property management over 30 years of doing it myself before I could afford to hire anyone. He asked intelligent questions. He took notes on his phone. At one point, he stopped in front of one of the buildings and looked up at the 4th floor, where a woman was standing in the window with a toddler on her hip, looking out at the parking lot. 48 units, he said. 48 families. Give or take families. Give or take, I said. It's been full for 6 years. He nodded slowly, not just nodding at the building, at something else. The shape of something, maybe. The way things add up over time if you let them. We stopped at a diner on the way back. I ordered tea. He ordered a coffee and a piece of butter tart, which he hasn't done since he was a teenager. We sat in the window booth and watched the highway traffic and didn't say much, which is a thing we've always done well together. He paid for the tea. I let him. That night, I came home to my 2-bedroom house in Waterloo and unlocked the door and stood in the kitchen for a moment in the dark before turning on the light. The folder from Francis was still on the corner of the desk. The card with the pressed flowers was in the kitchen drawer, the one I'd put it in the night of the party. I took it out and looked at it for a while. I put it back. Not because I was angry, because I'm not the kind of person who throws things away. I drove a 12-year-old Civic to my son's engagement party. I ironed my blouse twice. I made a card by hand with flowers from my garden. And in that room full of people who thought they knew what a woman like me was worth, I stood quietly and said nothing. That was not weakness. I have never needed anyone to understand what I've built. I only ever needed my son to understand it. And slowly, the way drywall patch dries, the way a furnace pays for itself over time, the way a duplex on a dead-end street becomes something nobody expected, he's starting to. The real check isn't the one he handed back. The real check is the one I'm still deciding whether he's ready to open. I still have the card. It's in the kitchen drawer, the one beside the stove where I keep things. I'm not ready to throw away. Pressed flowers from my own garden, dried flat and glued by hand the way I've always done them. $20,000 folded inside, handed back without being opened. I've thought a lot about what that moment cost me. Not the money. The money was fine. The money was always fine, though nobody in that room knew that. What it cost me was something harder to name, the particular sting of being dismissed by someone who had decided, before I'd said a word, exactly what I was worth. But here's what I've come to understand. Sitting at this kitchen table over the months since, the dismissal wasn't really about me. It was about her. About a woman who had spent years building a version of herself that couldn't survive honest scrutiny and who needed everyone around her to stay in their assigned roles. The wealthy family, the impressive venue, the quaint mother-in-law who drove an old car and made homemade cards. The moment I stopped fitting that role, the whole arrangement got complicated. That's how it works, I think. The people who move through the world performing rather than building eventually find themselves surrounded by others who are performing too. And when reality arrives, and it always does, in a folder on a Tim Hortons table, or in a bankruptcy notice filed 4 years ago, there's nothing underneath to hold. I didn't set out to teach anyone a lesson. I want to be clear about that. I hired Gordon because I was worried about my son, not because I wanted to be proven right. The difference matters. Wanting to be right is a small impulse. Wanting your child to be safe is a different thing entirely. It asks more of you. It's less satisfying in the moment, and it requires you to act without any guarantee that it will be received the way you hope. My son came to the garden center on a Thursday and moved flats of seedlings in the rain without being asked. That told me more than anything he could have said. What I've learned. What 32 years of early mornings and library books on drywall and duplex furnaces and midnight tenant calls have taught me is that character is not what you claim. It's what you do when no one is applauding. It's the decision you make at $47,000 when everyone tells you it's a bad investment. It's the way you show up on a Thursday in April when you don't have to. My son is figuring that out. Slowly, the way good things happen. I watch him take notes on his phone when we walk the Guelph property, and I see something in him that I recognize, not from looking in a mirror, but from watching his father. A kind of attention, a willingness to understand how things actually work, not just how they appear. The check is still in the drawer too. I haven't reissued it. I'm not being cruel about that. I'm being honest. Some things have to be ready before they can be received. I wasn't ready to give it to someone who would hand it back without opening it. I'm waiting until I'm sure it will land somewhere it can grow. The card with the pressed flowers is still beautiful, by the way. I looked at it again this morning. The larkspur held its color. Some things do if you press them at the right moment and give them time.